Imagine settling into your first-class seat, ready to enjoy a long-awaited flight, only for the flight attendant to treat you with blatant disrespect. This is exactly what happened to one unsuspecting passenger, and the shocking truth behind the encounter will leave you speechless. What started as a routine flight soon escalated into a confrontation that caught everyone off guard. The victim, a black man who found himself facing insults and an unexpected level of hostility, all while seated in the luxury of first class. How could this happen? Why did the flight attendant act this way? Was it a case of miscommunication or something deeper? In this video, we'll unravel the details of the incident, hear from those who were present, and dive into what really went down behind the scenes. Trust us when we say you won't believe the full story until you hear it from those involved. Stay tuned because what happens next might change the way you look at air travel and the treatment passengers receive in the sky. Keep watching to discover what went wrong, how the airline responded, and the shocking twist that nobody expected. As the flight took off, everything seemed normal at first. Passengers settled into their seats, and the flight attendants began their usual rounds, offering drinks and snacks. But what happened next was anything but typical. The man, a well-dressed and calm passenger, was seated in the front row of first class, enjoying his space and privacy. He had just settled in when the flight attendant approached, a smile on her face at first. But within moments, that smile faded, and what followed shocked everyone nearby. Eyewitnesses described the flight attendant as suddenly becoming cold and dismissive. She ignored the man's polite requests, offering other passengers their services first, even though he was seated in a prime spot in the cabin. The situation quickly escalated when she snapped at him for asking a simple question about his meal options. His polite inquiry was met with a sharp, rude response, leaving him stunned and confused. Was this just a misunderstanding, or was something more sinister at play? The man, now visibly frustrated, tried to remain calm, but the tension between them grew. The other passengers started noticing the odd interaction, whispering among themselves. And just when it seemed like the situation might cool down, the unthinkable happened. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and the man's patience was wearing thin. He had always flown first class to enjoy a certain level of comfort and respect, but this was far from the service he had come to expect. The flight attendant's behavior didn't seem random. There was something unsettling about the way she had been acting since the moment she arrived at his row. Some passengers, observing the scene, exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether they should intervene or just stay quiet. At one point, another flight attendant came over, likely sensing the rising tension, but instead of diffusing the situation, she too seemed dismissive. She didn't acknowledge the man's frustration and instead focused on getting the other first-class passengers settled. The more the man tried to explain his discomfort, the colder and more distant the staff became. It felt like no matter what he said, they were determined to silence him. As the flight went on, it became clear that something deeper was at play. Was this simply poor service, or was there something more troubling at the heart of the interaction? The passengers around him, who had initially ignored the tension, began whispering about what they'd witnessed. Some began to wonder if race was playing a role in how the man was being treated. After all, it was difficult to ignore the stark contrast between how he was being handled and the ease with which others were served. Was this just a case of bad luck, or was there something darker at play? The man began to feel the weight of isolation. No one stood up for him, and despite his calm demeanor, he could sense that the staff had already made up their minds about him. As the flight continued, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a one-time incident. Something had changed in the atmosphere, and the way the attendants treated him suggested they were making decisions about him before he even had a chance to explain himself. What were they thinking? What had sparked this cold treatment? And how far would they take it? As the hours passed, the unease in the cabin only grew. The man could feel eyes on him from every direction, but none of the passengers spoke up. The quiet murmurs around him were the only evidence that others were aware of the injustice taking place. He was caught in a limbo between anger and confusion, unsure whether to confront the flight attendants or just let the situation pass. But it was hard to shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was something more. Things reached a breaking point when the man, trying to remain as calm as possible, stood up to use the restroom. As he made his way toward the aisle, the flight attendant who had been dismissive earlier suddenly stepped into his path, blocking his way. Her expression was cold, almost as if she was daring him to make a move. The moment was tense, almost suffocating. The other passengers looked away, clearly uncomfortable, but not willing to intervene. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. The man, taken aback, asked if he could simply pass, but the flight attendant didn't move. For a few moments, it seemed like time itself had stopped. No one spoke. The whole situation was eerily silent, save for the hum of the plane's engines. The tension was unbearable. This standoff felt like it was leading to something bigger. Was this a final test? Would he be forced to defend himself publicly, or would this escalate into something far worse? Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, and the other passengers seemed to hold their breath, unsure of what might happen next. The flight attendant was no longer just a figure of authority. She was a symbol of something far more troubling, something that could change everything. Just when it seemed like the tension couldn't possibly get any thicker, another voice broke through the silence. It was a different flight attendant, this one seeming to emerge from the back of the cabin, and she wasn't the calm, professional figure one might expect. She walked toward the confrontation, her eyes locking on the man as if she knew exactly what was unfolding. Without a word, she stood beside the first flight attendant, as though backing her up. But then she said something that completely shifted the atmosphere in the cabin. "Sir, we need to address your behavior," she said, her tone sharp and accusatory. The man was stunned. He had been nothing but polite throughout the entire ordeal. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene. Yet here they were, seemingly ganging up on him. The second flight attendant went on to claim that his demeanor had made other passengers uncomfortable. The accusation was absurd. No one had said anything to him, and he had been nothing but courteous. But somehow, the two attendants had turned the situation into something he wasn't even a part of. Passengers who had previously been watching in silence now whispered among themselves. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to respond. Was this really happening? Was this a simple misunderstanding, or was something more sinister unfolding right in front of their eyes? The man stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. His mind raced. Was this an isolated incident, or was there a deeper issue at play, one he hadn't seen coming? The attendants, no longer even pretending to be neutral, stood in front of him as if daring him to speak out. And just as the man opened his mouth to defend himself, the unthinkable happened. A third flight attendant, someone he hadn't even noticed before, appeared in the aisle. She had a determined look on her face, and she was heading straight for him. What was going on? Why had so many staff members suddenly surrounded him? Was he about to be thrown off the plane? The stakes had just been raised, and every moment from here on out would determine whether he could finally get the respect he deserved, or if this was about to turn into a public nightmare. As the third flight attendant approached, the tension in the cabin was almost unbearable. The man's heart raced, and the murmur of whispers around him grew louder. For a moment, it felt like everything had spiraled out of control. The staff had surrounded him, and he wasn't sure what to expect next. Was he about to be kicked off the flight? Was this some kind of coordinated attack on him? Every worst-case scenario ran through his mind. But when the third attendant reached him, she did something no one expected. Instead of joining the other attendants in their accusatory stance, she turned to face them. "Why are you treating him like this?" she asked, her voice surprisingly firm. The two attendants looked at her, confused, as if they hadn't expected this intervention. She continued, "I've been watching everything unfold, and I don't see the problem. This man hasn't done anything wrong." The room fell silent as the other passengers processed what was happening. The first and second attendants were caught off guard, and for the first time, the man felt a glimmer of hope. But the story wasn't over yet. The third attendant, who had been quietly observing the situation, dropped a bombshell that completely flipped the narrative. "The reason they've been treating you this way," she said, looking directly at the man, "is because you were mistakenly identified as someone else. Someone who had a history of causing disruptions on flights." The man's jaw dropped. All this time, he had been subjected to harsh treatment, simply because the flight staff had confused him with another passenger. As the third attendant continued, she revealed that there had been an error in the passenger manifest, and the other man had been flagged for disruptive behavior. However, it wasn't him, it was someone else entirely. The first and second attendants stood frozen, clearly realizing their mistake. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted dramatically, and passengers began murmuring in disbelief at what had just been revealed. The third attendant, realizing the severity of the situation, apologized profusely to the man, offering to make it right. But the damage had already been done. Just when the situation seemed to be resolved, the third attendant pulled out a phone from her pocket and showed the man a picture. It was a photo of the man's seatmate, someone sitting just a few rows behind him. "This is the person who should have been flagged," she said, pointing at the photo. "And I think you'll find it very interesting that the person sitting behind you is actually the real troublemaker." The man turned around, his eyes wide with shock. His seatmate, who had been quiet, polite, and seemingly harmless, was now staring back at him with an expression that sent a chill down his spine. The twist was more than he could have ever imagined. What was this person really up to? And how deep did this conspiracy run? The story wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. The man's eyes locked onto his seatmate, who now sat eerily still, a faint but nervous smile playing on his lips. For a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. The third flight attendant had just revealed the unthinkable, that the person sitting behind him was the one who had been flagged for disruptive behavior, not him. But why hadn't anyone noticed? Why had the attendants treated him like an outsider, and not the person who truly posed a threat? The realization hit like a freight train. The third attendant, sensing the shift in the room, continued. "The person in the seat behind you is a known troublemaker, someone who's been involved in several incidents. His history of causing issues on flights led to a mix-up when he boarded. Unfortunately, the system mistakenly flagged you as the person to be watched. But it's him." She pointed at the seatmate again, her voice growing stronger. As the man turned back to face his seatmate, something in his gut told him this wasn't just a simple mistake. There was something more to this, a much bigger game at play. He watched the seatmate carefully, but now the man could see the unease in his eyes. The smile had faded, replaced by a flicker of tension. Suddenly, the seatmate stood up, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said quickly, his voice shaky, but his eyes betraying his fear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." His words hung in the air, thick with anxiety. Before anyone could respond, the third attendant's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen and froze. "I've just received confirmation," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "There's been a major security breach. This man is not just a disruptive passenger. He's part of a larger operation." The revelation hit like a punch to the stomach. The seatmate wasn't just an ordinary troublemaker. He was involved in something far more sinister. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted again, this time with an entirely new sense of urgency. The flight crew scrambled to act, and passengers watched in stunned silence as the man's seatmate, realizing the jig was up, made a sudden dash toward the front of the plane. But the attendants were already on alert. They quickly blocked his path, securing him before he could make it any farther. Just as the tension seemed to peak, a new voice rang out from the cockpit. "This is Captain Carter speaking. We've been made aware of a potential threat on board. Please remain seated and stay calm. We're handling the situation." The man's heart pounded. This had escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. It wasn't just an incident of poor service. It was an attempt to smuggle something or someone dangerous on the flight. As the plane continued its course, the man realized that what he had thought was a simple misunderstanding had turned into a high-stakes situation that was far from over. The real question now was, who else on this flight could be involved? And how far would this investigation go? The twists kept coming, and the answers weren't anywhere near as simple as they first seemed.